new music group here. So let's just keep going, and before we get into the questions, let's just go down the line. We know Josh, but James and Lindsay, why don't you guys introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm James Chanter, Media Director M6. We are quite young. We're about 10 years old as an agency, joint venture between Group M and our creative agency, the M Partnership. We are even younger in this market in North America. We're only about 4 years out, so we like to describe ourselves as sort of the first media agency born in the addressable age. And I think some of the things we're talking about today should, I guess, speak to that to some extent.
I'm Lindsay Pullins. I work for Empower in Cincinnati, Ohio. We are a full service media agency. I lead the programmatic offering called Clear Trade at Empower, where we really focus on transparency. And my role has definitely evolved over the last, 2 years as advanced television, the term programmatic television, even though I totally agree with what you're saying, that it is not anywhere close to digital. And bridging that gap between the television team and the digital folks.
Great. And so this panel is really about trying to find these audiences and how do you use data to stitch together those audiences across different platforms. Josh, you gave us the last example there was around pharmaceutical or back pain and back type issues. Are there other examples you could give us in terms of what's working?
Yeah, so again, I think it really does come down to the category and price point of the product, and I stress the lifetime value of that consumer. So if you think about that, pharmaceutical works extremely well based on price points and the lifetime value of bringing a customer in. Auto as well. And as well as even niche specialties within, call it household goods segments. So think of the world of vacuums and things of that nature. And even things of kitchen services as well.
So James and Lindsay, what's working for you guys in terms of thinking about stitching these audiences together? When does it make sense?
I mean, to your point, I think it makes sense, with regards to the product and, what is the lifetime value, return ad spend, et cetera, et cetera. We see that work for example, a client that's in the sort of financial services space, life insurance space, retirement planning, works very well in terms of what the brand's trying to achieve. Other brands, not so much, and it really does depend on being able to measure end to end, from start to finish. Is the media effective, and is the activity effective, and is ultimately it worth paying that premium at the front to have the results at the back?
And I'll just say, Alan, one thing is that I haven't seen a campaign not work, and meaning we've seen a lift in response or an improvement in terms of the effective CPM. The question is, does that lift and improvement offset the cost premium? And I think that's the question you need to think about. Even if you saw some of the charts from some other presenters and they say, oh, plus 12% lift, what was the cost premium to get that 12% lift? That's what I'm just saying. That's what we need to question and think about.
I agree. How about you, Lindsay?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of 2 clients in particular, and their products are very, very different. One has a price point average sale of like $47, and the other one has an average price point of $1,500. And we've tested both in kind of the advanced television space where we're using first or third-party data. And in both, we've seen great success. It depends on the data set that we're using. First-party data has driven a much, much higher return, or modeling off that first-party data has driven a much, much higher return. The CPM is a huge shock, but it's all about testing in small scales. So starting with like $500,000, which in an overall TV budget is not that much, but in gradually increasing it until you feel comfortable at scale. And going all in at first is never, in my opinion, a good idea, because that CPM is so high, you're not going to see the return. But it's that balance of finding the right audience, building a relationship with that audience. If you're able to use segmented first-party data and identify specific attributes or specific third-party data and target individual audiences, improve out those results, then you can kind of scale up from there.
Yeah, but I would also say, Lindsay, don't forget about the storytelling. I mean, Bryant showed us through Purple the importance, and I guess that's something that I think is somewhat missing in this space of bridging the creative with the media selection, or if you would, segments, consumer segments.
I mean, I think that's really interesting. It's exactly the approach that we take, and I thought that Bryant's presentation was super interesting, and it's something that we do as well. One of the things we're doing now for a couple of clients is actually building out. Building addressability into our segmentation. So effectively, not just running a segmentation study which produces a deck which sits on someone's desk or goes on a shelf, or as we all know that happens, but actually building addressability into our segmentation. So running running our own studies with certain partners, online panel surveys effectively, and then matching that back to our DMP. So then in doing that, we can sub-segment based on attitudinal questions that we ask in the segmentation, and then we can actually deliver hyper-relevant creative to those segments. And then on top of that, we can not just build out lookalike models based on those attitudinal answers, but also we can layer on intent. So we can say, well, actually, this person will respond to this creative, and they're also in market for a life insurance product, for example.
How do you feel in terms of what are the reactions to production budgets and associated with developing so many and nuanced creative?
It really depends. I mean, some places develop that content in-house. That's often cheaper. If you're working with an agency, a creative agency, that can be more expensive. But again, to Bryant's point earlier, it was interesting. It doesn't have to be expensive, and especially if that's just cuts of the same story, the same piece of content, just cut different ways or with different pieces added in. And actually, from a production standpoint, you can, record different lines, shoot different scenes that are going to be hyper relevant to those subsegments.
Lindsay, did you have, you gave us some examples, but as we were talking about creative, and maybe this is for everyone, not just Lindsay, how much do you rely, or how much do you team with a creative partner at the client, whether it's the client or another agency that's involved in the mix? It seems critical to make
It's absolutely critical. In those two examples that I gave, one does their creative in-house and is more flexible and easy, and listening to us and taking our advice on specific ways to cut it. And what they've found effective is, like you said, cutting it in different versions, essentially using the same creative, but the intro might be different pending the audience. And then on the other side, using user-generated content, that's primarily on the digital side, but user-generated content, especially in the social spaces, has proven out really, really effective and is super cheap.
And my experience has been completely varied. Sometimes we're included and integrated from a media standpoint with those stakeholders on the creative side. Most cases, if a client's producing in-house, it tends to actually work best because they're, I think, a little bit more nimble, a little bit quick, and but we need to improve upon that, quite frankly.
No, I was going to agree with you. I absolutely think so. Because we actually sit with our creative agency in our New York office, so we hot desk with our creative agency, and about 30% of our clients are actually shared with the creative agency. And I think in that case, it does work more easily. It does, if you're kind of in the same office doing the same thing every day, it works more easily. But also, for the financial services clients I mentioned, I probably spent sort of back end of last year and into the beginning of this year more than 50% of my time at their creative agency, because we were working on a huge project and we were working as one team, and that was an important part of what we do to deliver better results for the client ultimately.
So there's a lot of data that you're putting together. We saw how complex that could be earlier this morning. Where are the head scratchers, the problem points today, and have you found any solutions to it? So,
I think one of the bigger things, as I grew up in digital and learning the television space, digital, it's very easy to take a third-party or first-party audience and apply it across many different channels. It's simple. Using programmatic means it's basically a click of a button. Learning the television side, every partner ingests the data differently. They don't work with the same, whether it's Axiom or Experian, or they don't work the same way. So then you're taking a first-party audience and you might be modeling it differently across different providers. It's so complex. I think over the last 6 months, there's been some strides with OpenAP and kind of learning from the digital perspective, but that's a big issue because at that point, then you're like, you have 6 different audiences across 6 different, platforms, and each one is in its own silo, performing a different way. So it's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue of fragmentation, right? So it's like, and the classic example, and when we were talking the other day about this, it's like I have audiences that are performing incredibly well and sub-segmented audiences built in our DMP right now. I can't target those audiences on Facebook. So I have to take proxy segments and do what we can to try and reach the same people. Problem is they're attitudinal-based segments. So it's not just a demo. I can't just say it's women 25 to 34. You actually have to really try and build out the same segments. Are they the same people? We hope so, but potentially not, and we can't even look at what's the overlap there, so we can't even control, frequency across those channels.
I may ask a seemingly provocative question. Is all of this really worth it?
So, I mean, I can answer that. I mean, I can tell you guys two stories to answer that question. So, with the financial services brand that I mentioned before, we tested this new sub-segmentation for the first time on a spot that was 3.5 minutes long, engaging, entertaining piece of comedy actually that we created and worked on a big program. We were seeing 85% plus video completion rates against those audiences versus generic audiences for that program. And this is skippable video. This is a really long spot. It's 3.5 minutes long, and we're seeing huge volume of video viewed against that audience. So yes, it's performed. For another client in the luxury space, a jewelry brand, last year, we actually tested removing all of our targeting. So we were targeting affluent individuals, users who were potentially in market to buy jewelry products, buying jewelry around key kind of holidays, whether it's Mother's Day or graduation, et cetera, et cetera. And actually born out of a question from the client about high CPMs. I mean, the CPMs were very high to reach that audience. So we tested just adults 18 plus. CPMs dropped by they're about 6 times lower. Our web traffic to website, the e-commerce site, increased somewhere in the region of 30–40%, but ultimately our sales by revenue increased by somewhere in the region of 15% from that activity. So in that instance, targeting didn't work, and actually the lower front-end CPM, potentially the brand halo effect of just delivering content and video to so many more people, had an overall better result.
I mean, I would say look at Brian's chart of, I think it was Casper versus Purple. I would say in that instance it illustrates, to a certain extent it's worth it. However, if you said I'm going to sit on the sidelines for a while until all this stuff gets straightened out, I don't think that's necessarily so awful as well. But I do think it's important to not even experiment, but to certainly have a strong understanding of what the opportunity is, or opportunities are, and the limitations.
Let's take some questions from the audience.
Hi, Samantha, Ocean Media. Have any of you tested any of the national PTV products like Engage, ATP, Audience Now with Turner? And if so, what have you seen?
We are planning to do something with Turner, but have not executed yet. So I don't have anything to share. So far, so good, but I don't have anything to share.
Same from my.
Okay. Another question? It's a quiet group this morning.
I maybe have a question.
We got one over
Go
there.
ahead.
And then Lindsay, you're up.
Hi, Kendall from Modus Direct. I kind of really enjoy the story of removing targeting and performance improving. I tell that story to my clients a lot, and sometimes it's hard to convince them beforehand, but I'm just curious if anyone else has had a similar experience, and how also do you educate your clients on why sometimes advanced targeting is not their friend?
Yeah, I mean, I really start with the old-fashioned ROI calculator. You know, not the most exciting visual, but really impactful to say, okay, this is what we need to see in order for the results to be successful, and then draw on our past history and learnings, whether it's coming from our other clients or, more importantly, coming from what they've seen success in, let's say, in the digital landscape and online video landscape, and try to apply those learnings in terms of uplift to, let's say, their linear TV or advanced TV campaign from that perspective. That's one of the first exercises I like to do.
I'd say ROI definitely, or ROAS, and we've taken a lot of audience learnings from digital specifically, and then applying them and seeing if we can apply them to television, depending on what's working and what's not. And right there you can start eliminating kind of the waste that might not be as profitable on the television side. And it honestly goes back to baby stepping. Just give me a test budget. If we feel like the numbers are right, let's baby step in there. Let's see how it performs quarter over quarter, and just keep increasing until, well, or not, depending on the results. But I would say, you know, any digital learnings you can have, especially from an audience perspective, and then applying them over and doing the math is how we start.
I think to add to that, it's slightly kind of evolving the conversation a little bit, but I think one of the more interesting things as well, and one of the challenges from when you're looking to do this, when you are looking to use data to target and then activate in addressable channels, I think things have got better over the last kind of year, 2 years, 3 years, but actually, you know, you wouldn't believe the number of people, I shouldn't say this in this room, but within our industry, who, you know, still don't kind of fully kind of understand, or stakeholders within businesses and clients who don't fully understand the nature of addressable media, you know, and that shift away from contextual to addressable, and you know, there are obviously sort of risks and pitfalls that come with that. You know, brand safety is a huge one, and we're not going to talk about that specifically now, but then again, even when you're buying, say, addressable TV, you know, some clients, you know, like to insist on seeing prelogs for TV, you know, before, you know, before your ads go live, you know, or get regular prelogs. Well, you can't get that with addressable TV. You don't know where you're, you know, where you're going to appear, and that contextual alignment can have problems, you know. And you know, I won't go into specifics, but there, you know, we have encountered issues whereby, you know, someone somewhere has seen something that they didn't feel was right, and actually you have to say, well, it's kind of slightly less relevant because you actually, you know, we've used data to target the right person, and if that person is in your target audience and it has, you know, potential to convert, or, you know, potential to you know, change their opinion towards the brand, or, you know, whatever the goal is, then actually, you know, you've kind of achieved your job and achieved your purpose in a more efficient way. So it's an education piece, but I think also it's you know, being smarter with data on the brand safety side as well, to you know, to try and make sure it's, you know, safe as possible, contextual as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it is tough in terms of not knowing where you're running, but I think the larger issue is and you know, Rashad from Publicis, you know, chief strategy guy, is, you know, if you're stuck in the containers of the past, you're not going to be successful in the future. And I think that holds us back to a certain extent, but that's also where I'm torn. Because I've run a lot of, let's say, traditional DRTV call response campaigns. They're not successful in these environments, not successful in online video environments, not successful in advanced TV environments. It just doesn't work in terms of producing an increase in, let's say, incremental call volume. So that means we have to think about measurement differently. What is the KPI? You know, are we looking at the overall business improvement? In a lot of cases, that's a problem, because if you're just doing it with a small test budget, you're probably not moving the needle enough in investment to see any type of holistic lift. Those are the things that keep me up at night a little bit from that perspective, because at the same time, if you are moving away from those containers of the past, is that cheating a certain extent? If you're creating a new goal and a new KPI, are you creating that new KPI just because the old one's not working? Or are you creating a new KPI because the old one you're seeing inefficient results against, so you need something else to point to that is showing success? Those, I think, are some of the things that I battle with, certainly.
I'm curious, James, what did you learn from that contrast between the financial client that blew up when you used proper targeting and the jewelry brand that didn't, and where it didn't make much of a difference at all? Was that a category anomaly? What was the repeatable effect there?
I think to some extent it's a category anomaly. The luxury space has a lot of big brands that were investing a lot more than my client, and ultimately in biddable media, if you're investing more, if you're bidding more, you win more impressions. It's that simple. It's not that simple, but no, I think it's a category thing to some extent. And when you're trying to reach a very small audience, affluent audience, it's small and there's a lot of competition. Whereas when you're going a little bit more mass, I think obviously it's cheaper. I think it's a case by case situation though. So it really underlines the importance of test and learn. And actually, the jewelry brand was much more of a performance activity, whereas the financial services brand was much more of a branding initiative. So different things, but I think what it shows is actually that what you would traditionally think, for performance media, you want to be hyper-targeted, hyper-relevant. Well, actually, not necessarily. And for branding activity, you want to go more mass. And actually, we kind of flipped it in these two tests and saw positive results in each case. So I think it really just underlines the importance of test and learn. It underlines the infancy that elements of the industry are in right now, and the fact that we're all trying to navigate a huge network and web of sort of complexity with using data to target or targeting generally.
I also think that the mistakes you could make are exaggerated within the advanced television space specifically, meaning if you have the wrong target selection in your planning capacity, that's going to get exaggerated in the impact. If you did it more of a mass buy, if you maybe made a mistake in the age, you're still reaching enough people that some of those are still the right people. But as soon as you're going to a very finite and niche target experience, if you're off on that target, whether it's the marketer, the agency, I don't care who, you're going to see very poor results. So that's why I say the mistakes can be exaggerated versus a more mass campaign. The other thing that I also say that it could set yourself up wrong is prospecting to a certain extent. So for instance, to take the old case of dog and cat food, if you're just targeting people that have previously bought dog food, but I could be in the market for a dog even though I'm not buying that currently. So that's kind of the notion of where sometimes more mass in certain cases may actually still work better than going through all the targeting rigor. And by the way, it may not be an or, it's probably an and.
We've talked a lot about this paying out. How are you reporting this back to clients? What are you measuring for them on their behalf?
I mean, it starts, at least from my campaigns that we work on, it starts at the upper funnel all the way through acquisition, conversion. So we're looking at things of reach and reach of the strategic target audience, and then converting that to metrics that I hate, such as CPM or effective CPM. But also looking at what the conversion and response lift, as well as the overall conversions in terms of did it work. And then tying that to the profitability. So one of the things that I see as well is it's not just the volume, but also did the revenue per customer increase. In a lot of cases you do see that, so understanding those metrics in a full kind of ROI evaluation is critical.
I think it's absolutely right. I think metrics like impressions, for example. We very much see them. They're important. They have a bearing. CPMs have a bearing, but they're very much optimization metrics to the extent that they're not business changing. A lower CPM is not going to change a business. It's not going to drive in itself results. So we first and foremost look at what is business changing? What are the metrics? What do we actually want to achieve from a business objective? What's the role of comms within that? And that could be, obviously different for different campaigns, of course. So for more of a brand activity, you're looking at brand equity metrics, brand tracking. Whereas for performance activity, you're looking at a much more harder sales goal. I think that's absolutely fine, and it's nothing. It's not rocket science. It's nothing new. But it's amazing how many people do focus on what is, I would say, the wrong thing rather than the right thing. But then secondly, and this I think is really interesting, when you are running addressable media, when you are running campaigns where you can capture data, well, you put data in at the front end, but then during the campaign, you're generating data, you're generating clickstream data and digital, et cetera, et cetera. So who is consuming our content at the upper funnel? How do we build remessaging pools out of that? How big are those remessaging pools? How relevant are those remessaging pools? And in one ways, that is almost one of the most important KPIs, because especially when you're running full funnel activity, having those really robust audiences that have seen, consumed, engaged with your video, wherever that may be, and I do see that as being completely channel agnostic, device agnostic, screen agnostic, whether it's the big screen in the corner of the living room or the small screen in your pocket. How do we remessage them, and what do we remessage them with? So there's obviously a role of data in that, and then connecting that data to creative, as we discussed earlier.
So I have a little bit of a different opinion in that I do think the screen matters, and I say that because the consumption may be similar in that regard, but the consumer's ability to respond, not just consume, but to engage and respond is very different across different screens. So I think actually the screen and the delivery point is actually critical in that equation, and sometimes gets overlooked.
What are you finding out about those differences? I mean, I think, what are you finding out about those differences in terms of receptivity and mode? It's not just interactivity, isn't it, that we're in different modes across different screens? It's not, I mean, I sort of started this event with that, kind of trying to debunk that idea that the consumer doesn't care where they get their video. I think they do, and I think we're making choices and learning to make choices across screens, and it does have to do with the mood and the mode that we're in. And that does reflect on our receptivity to all messages and content.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly the element of consumer trust in specific environments, and I think that trust will play into the receptivity in terms of, do I trust the source? Is it meaningful? Am I going to buy because of that? But I've seen in terms of our results too, just from, again, I mentioned it in even the agency tools that we do, and looking at things like attentiveness levels. Sometimes that's a good thing. From a brand marketer, you want somebody staying tuned for the full commercial break. But from a direct response marketer and me, sometimes not having as much attention says I could pick up the phone and move away. I mean, sports programming and live sports programming more specifically is an area that traditionally doesn't work for direct response marketers, because somebody's so clued into that Washington Capitals game, they're not going to move away from a 3-3 tie in the third period to pick up the phone and respond to an advertisement. Just the reality of it. So I think you have to understand it, play around, and understand that environment is critical and is important, and the pricing associated with that environment.
I think that's the case. I do agree. I think it's interesting though when you talk about TV and the sports, et cetera, but it's still hard to understand how engaged is that audience. So in a commercial break, are you in the kitchen making coffee? Are you you're not necessarily watching? Whereas then on a smaller device, say a phone or a tablet, and you are watching video in full screen, then you're probably going to be engaged in looking at that. So I think it's tough. Like that's data that we don't have. We don't know if someone's television is on, but they're in the kitchen making coffee. We don't know if someone is is playing video on their phone and is engaged with it. So it's paying attention to the differences between channels, but also, as I said before, trying to capture as much data on who has seen, consumed, engaged video, and how they've seen, consumed, and engaged video.
I think most marketers leverage still the deterministic model in certain cases, saying, oh, a spot ran at this time, what did we see in terms of response lift? And that's a valuable metric, certainly, and maybe something that provides a comparative and relative. You could, gauge the response burst that occurs, but understand there's especially a huge drag factor that occurs, and that drag factor is incredibly hard to measure. So advertising in live sports actually may have produced an impact, but that impact couldn't be clearly measured and differentiated versus other placements, so it looks less effective and less efficient. It's just really hard to tease out from an analytics perspective.
Lindsay, did you have?
I'm good.
Okay. All right. Any final questions?
Alan, panel, thank you very much. We're going to continue this in a roundtable at the end of the morning, but right now we're going to go to a coffee break. So grab some coffee, and we'll be back to talk about brand safety in about 20 minutes.